Hello and a quiet welcome to Sleepless Homo. If you find yourself here, it is likely because your mind is still turning, still searching for a signal in the noise. Perhaps you are lying in the dark, trying to coax your brain towards sleep. Maybe you are in the kitchen, preparing a meal that feels more like a ritual than sustenance. You could be walking through a gentle rain the world, muted by headphones, or sitting at a desk long after the sun has set, wondering why consciousness ever preceded the invention of coffee. Wherever you are, whatever the hour, this is your harbour. This is long-form, evidence-based history told slowly. Here, you will find no manufactured drama, no sensational hype. There is only deep time, the soft sciences, and a calm voice attempting to make sense of the profoundly strange decisions our species has made and continues to make. If this particular cadence of storytelling serves you, whether it helps you to unwind, to focus your thoughts, or simply to feel a little less alone in the quiet hum of 2 a.m., then I would be grateful if you chose to like the video and subscribe. In a world saturated with loudness, your support genuinely helps more people discover this kind of quiet contemplative content. It's a small signal, but it helps others find their way here too. And I am always curious about how this space is used. If you want to share your own ritual, listening before bed, during a long drive while cleaning the house, or zoning out at the gym, please leave a comment. Let me know what your routine is or where in this wide world you happen to be listening from. Also, if you find yourself drifting off somewhere along our journey tonight, please do not worry. I have placed detailed timestamps in the description so you can easily find your way back to the story the next day. This one, I promise, is worth hearing from its beginning to its end. It is important you know this is not a channel for unrestrained theories or cinematic reenactments. I am simply one human, doing my very best to narrate these stories with integrity, using the tools of archaeology, genetics, and the scattered beautiful scraps of memory our species has left behind. I certainly do not possess all the answers. In fact, I have very few. But I will always remain honest about what we can reasonably know and what we must accept we will probably never uncover. This commitment to evidence is our anchor. It prevents us from projecting our own modern myths onto the past, ensuring we see our ancestors not as monsters or saints, but simply as people facing immense challenges with the tools they had. And as always, I invite you to stay curious and to stay calm. Let us begin. Tonight's story is about the complete origins of war, a journey into why we started killing each other, stretching from 500,000 years ago all the way to the dawn of the first great states around 3000 BCE. Together, I will walk you through the quiet, unsettling evolution of violence itself. We will move from scattered bones and sharpened stones to fortified towns and the haunting absence of their men. This is not a history of battles. It is the story of something far older, something that stirs just beneath the surface of our own lives. So, let us go back, far back. If war is ancient, then what came before it? Can violence even exist without the structure of war? Can it exist without generals, without flags, or even without language itself? The bones, when they speak at all, suggest something strange. The further back we look, the more we see the faint traces of conflict. Yet there is a line in the dust we cannot seem to cross, a point in the deep past where the trail simply vanishes into silence. Before tactics, before territory, before even humans as we know them, there was still violence. Not war, but something more elemental. A sudden sharp shove in the darkness, a bite, a scream that goes unanswered, a foraging party that simply did not come back. To truly understand when war began, we must first have the courage to ask a simpler and perhaps more difficult question. When did we begin hurting each other on purpose? To find that answer, we must journey to a world that was not yet our own, a world being reshaped by forces far older than any human grudge. So let's begin there, in the deep time of Africa, where the first steps toward us and our conflicts were taken. Around 2 million years ago, something irreversible was happening in Africa. The world itself was changing its breath. The vast, humid forests that had cradled our earliest ancestors for millennia were beginning to shrink, pulling back like a slow green tide. In their place, open grasslands expanded, rolling out across the continent and fundamentally reshaping the rules of life and competition. This was not merely a change in climate, it was a profound shift in ecology, a new kind of pressure, a different equation for energy. Trees had always meant safety. Their branches were a refuge, their canopy a shield. But the open ground offered only exposure, and exposure for any creature demanded a strategy. The hominins of this era, what we would now call early times, Homo times, species-like times Homo habilis times, or the first iterations of times Homo erectus times, were being forced into a new evolutionary game. It was a game that rewarded cooperation, that prized memory, and that more than anything else depended on the ability to recognize who belonged to your group and who did not. No one was building armies. That idea was still millions of years away, but they were building bonds. Within the fragile circle of the group, protection meant everything: access to food, to mates, to shared warmth and safety, and perhaps even to a primitive form of care. This is the great paradox of our lineage. The very same social glue that held groups together, that fostered loyalty and sacrifice for kin, also drew the first sharp line between times us, times and times them. Between those inside the circle of trust and those who stood outside it, things were not always so friendly. To track how deep the roots of conflict truly go, researchers have spent decades studying our closest living relatives, and this is precisely where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because the deeper we look into the behavior of chimpanzees, not the softened, domesticated version you might see in a zoo, but the wild, territorial, and brutally strategic chimpanzees found in places like Gombe and Ngogo, the more we see the seeds of what could one day become war. In the dense forests of eastern and central Africa, wild chimpanzees live in what primatologists call fission-fusion societies. This means they form flexible, shifting subgroups, often gathering in larger bands for social events, or splitting off into smaller units to forage for food. But the larger social structure the community holds, each community has a core territory, and when the males of one group cross into the range of another, things can turn terrifyingly violent. In one of the most haunting observations ever recorded in the natural world, the primatologist Jane Goodall documented a pattern of coordinated lethal attacks by the chimpanzees of one community against the males of a neighbouring one. These were not random fights over food, they were ambushes. A patrol of males would travel in ghostly silence to the edge of their territory and push into rival lands. If they found a lone individual, they would attack with overwhelming and terrifying force. In these encounters, no food was taken, no immediate resources were claimed. The violence was intentional, it was targeted, and it was repeated. This is a crucial insight for our closest relatives. Strategic violence is not always a chaotic burst of rage. It is often a cold, calculated tool used to achieve a long-term goal. In the Ngogo community in Uganda's Kibale National Park, researchers tracked a prolonged campaign of such attacks that spanned more than a decade. Over time, one group of chimpanzees systematically expanded their territory by killing off the male rivals in a neighbouring group, eventually absorbing a significant portion of the defeated community's range. This expansion led directly to increased access to valuable fruit trees and, critically, to more reproductive females. If this sounds suspiciously strategic, that is because it's island. But we must be clear, this is not war, at least not by any formal human definition. There were no written declarations, no complex alliances, no symbolic flags. There was only a primal calculus, a brutal arithmetic: more land, more food, more mates, more chances for your genes to survive, and fewer enemies to stand in your way. So what do we call this behaviour? Some scholars argue this is a form of proto-warfare, the evolutionary blueprint for organised conflict. Others insist we should not project our human categories onto chimpanzee behaviour, but what truly matters is the pattern itself. The group acts in concert. The individual suffers the consequences. There is motive, there is execution, and there is a clear, tangible benefit. And above all, there is memory. These are not accidental skirmishes forgotten by morning. They are acts with lasting consequences that shape the behaviour of the community for years to come. In some ways, they reveal what violence looks like when it is stripped of all ideology and politics, what it looks like when it is just strategy and flesh, and the cold logic of survival. If our closest cousins engage in such calculated violence, what then can we expect to find in the scattered remains of our own ancient family? The truth is, the fossil record is far quieter and far more frustrating. Now, if this kind of intergroup aggression exists in our chimpanzee cousins, what about in our own early ancestors? Can we see the distinct traces of it etched into the fossil record? The truth, as frustrating as it is profound, is almost not at all. The deeper into the past we journey, the fewer bones we have to guide us, and the harder it becomes to confidently identify a cause of death. We do not have battlefield cemeteries from 2 million years ago. There are no weapon-strewn ruins or mass graves to excavate. Instead, what we have are scattered fragments, a lower jaw found in a dry riverbed, a piece of a crushed skull, a handful of teeth. Most of these precious remains are badly weathered by millennia of sun and rain, crushed by the immense pressure of shifting earth, or are simply too incomplete to tell a clear story. Violence, especially the kind that is quick and brutal, is often an event that interrupts the very processes of preservation. A body left in the open air is swiftly returned to the ecosystem, its bones scattered by scavengers long before they can become fossils. Occasionally, however, a faint hint emerges from the silence. A fracture here, a healed wound there. These are not conclusive proofs, nothing like the grim slaughter pits of the later Neolithic, but they are just enough to suggest that the line between survival and violence was already being drawn in the Pleistocene dirt. In the limestone caves of Sterkfontein in what is now South Africa, some hominin fossils, possibly belonging to time's Australopithecus, times or an early species of times, Homo times, show cranial damage that some researchers believe could be the result of interpersonal violence. A blow from a rock perhaps, or a club. Yet other experts argue just as persuasively that the damage was caused by predation, by falling rocks from the cave roof, or by breakage that occurred long after death. The truth is we do not know. And that is the central problem with studying our deep prehistory. It resists certainty. We can see the hints, but we cannot yet read the full story. This ambiguity teaches us a crucial lesson about science itself. It is not always about finding definitive answers, but about learning to live with the weight of probabilities, with the humility of not knowing for sure. What we can say with more confidence is that by around 1.8 million years ago, that with the rise of times, Homo erectus times, things were fundamentally changing. This was a new kind of hominin, a species with a significantly larger brain, a body plan, much more like our own, and a new, more complex kind of social structure. Their longer legs and arched feet were built for endurance, for walking and running across the expanding grasslands. They moved in coordinated groups, they hunted, they ranged far beyond the familiar shelter of the forests, and in one of the most successful migrations in mammalian history, they spread out from their African homeland and into the vast unknown landscapes of Eurasia. This success, however, brought with it a new set of pressures. With greater mobility came more frequent encounters with other groups. With defined territories came competition, and with all of this, an increasing need to defend what you had. At this stage in our evolution, it is highly likely that most conflict remained informal and reactive. Imagine a tense confrontation over a scarce waterhole during a dry season, a violent standoff over a freshly killed carcass, with one group trying to drive another away, a sudden chaotic encounter between two foraging parties that ended with loud threats, chest-beating displays, or the occasional deadly tragic exchange. These encounters would not have looked anything like war. There were no formations, No leaders issuing commands from a distance, just flashes of raw tension where the primal instincts for survival collided head-on. These early conflicts were likely not driven by a desire for conquest or glory, but by the immediate desperate need to secure the resources that would allow your small kin group to see another sunrise. The line between defending your family and aggressing against another's was likely very thin indeed. And so for over 1,000,000 years, violence flickered at the very edges of hominin life. It was not a constant organized feature of their world, but it was always possible. A background condition of existence, sometimes reactive, sometimes strategic, but always lurking just beneath the fragile surface of cooperation. So what were the internal dynamics that shaped this behavior? Did these early humans live in egalitarian bands, or were their lives structured by the same kind of dominance hierarchies we see in other social primates? A significant part of the answer lies in the harsh logic of dominance hierarchies, a social structure found among many social primates, including baboons, macaques, and chimpanzees. For these species, hierarchies structure nearly everything. Access to mates, to the best food, to the safest sleeping sites. And wherever there is a hierarchy, there are challenges. Individuals compete fiercely for status. Temporary coalitions form as weaker members band together to overthrow a stronger one. Allies betray each other in moments of opportunity. In this tense and dynamic social world, violence is never far away. For early times, Homo times, these dynamics would have been just as real, just as consequential. Whether through sheer intimidation, through ritualized displays of strength, or through outright physical force, some individuals likely used aggression to rise within their group, while others fell because of it. But it is critical to understand that this was still personal violence, not collective war. It was about one individual's place in the pecking order, not one group's campaign against another. Even within the fragile safety of the group, aggression could be deadly. Among chimpanzees, for instance, infanticide is a disturbingly common occurrence. Among early humans, this behavior would leave even fewer traces in the fossil record, but it may very well have been present. The evolutionary logic is as simple as it is brutal. If a new male took over a group or rose to the top of its hierarchy, eliminating the offspring of his predecessor could bring the females back into estrus more quickly, thereby ensuring that his own genes and not his rivals would spread faster. These patterns are not unique to humans or our ancestors, but they hint at a truth we often choose to ignore, that violence is not an invention. It is a capacity, a deep-seated potential that can be directed, structured, or suppressed by culture, but perhaps never entirely erased. The existence of such internal violence provides a crucial insight for our ancestors. The greatest threat was not always the predator lurking in the tall grass. Sometimes it was the individual sleeping right beside them. The environment, of course, played its own powerful role. Periods of prolonged drought, of resource scarcity, of profound ecological disruption would have placed enormous stress on these small hominin groups. Scarcity breeds desperation, and desperation has a way of making cooperation dangerously fragile. It is entirely possible that some of the earliest violent deaths we can never see in the record were not caused by conflict between groups, but by breakdowns within them. A member who did not share their food, a sudden vicious fight over a piece of meat, a fatal misunderstanding that could not be undone, and so for more than 1,000,000 years, violence flickered at the edges of hominin life. It was not constant, it was not organized, but it was always possible, a background condition of existence, sometimes reactive, sometimes strategic, but always lurking just beneath the thin surface of cooperation. So where does that leave us? If chimpanzees can coordinate lethal attacks and early times, Homo times, lived in complex social groups under constant ecological pressure, then how do we define the line between this instinctual aggression and what we would call war? Is it tactics? Is it symbols? Is it memory? Or perhaps war is not defined by what we do, but by what we remember. Violence becomes war only when it becomes a story. when it is given a context, a meaning, when it shapes how a group sees itself and how it sees its enemies. And in this immense period from roughly 2 million to 500,000 years ago, there were no stories that we can read. There was no writing, there were no monuments, only fractured bones, scattered tools, and long-gone paths through ancient grass, the ghosts of decisions we may never fully understand. The question still hangs in the quiet air of deep time. If war wasn't here yet, then what was it waiting for? What was the missing ingredient? Did mastering fire make us more peaceful, or infinitely more dangerous? It's a question that still burns quietly behind the long timeline of our course, evolution. Because something did shift between 500,000 and 300,000 years ago, something invisible but irreversible. Fire did not just cook our food. It changed how we saw the night. It changed how we saw each other. And maybe, just maybe, it changed how we handled fear, conflict, and the intoxicating possibility of power. Fire is not a tool in the way a stone is. It cannot be held, only tended. It cannot be shaped, only guided. And yet it may be the oldest weapon we ever truly wielded, not against the beasts of the plains, but against each other. To understand how, we have to return to a world that had never known it, a world before hearths, before the deep, reassuring warmth against the skin, before the gift of controlled light. For millions of years, fire belonged to the sky and the earth, to the sudden, violent crack of lightning and the slow, ominous bleed of volcanoes. It was a spectacle, a terror, something to be avoided at all costs. And then sometime in the deep lower Paleolithic, someone stopped running from it. The earliest signs of fire used by hominins may go back even further than this. Sites like Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa show traces of ash and burned bone that could date as far back as 1 million years. But by 500,000 years ago, fire was no longer an occasional, terrifying accident. It was a presence. At places like Gesher Beno Yaakov in the Jordan Valley, archaeologists have found charred wood, burnt flint artifacts, and thermally altered seeds. Clear, unmistakable signs that fire was being used regularly, deliberately. It had been tamed. What does this mean for violence? At first glance, nothing at all. But fire is never just fire. It is a centre, a symbol, a claim. Once a group has a fire, they have a place. They have a boundary. Other animals keep their distance. Predators hesitate at the edge of the light. And rival humans must now reckon with something more than just numbers and brute strength. A campfire burning in the deep of night is a signal, a declaration. It says, "Times, we are here. We are awake. We are not alone." Asterisk. In this way, fire becomes territorial. Not by design, perhaps, but by inevitable consequence. It is a marker of control, and wherever there is control, there is something worth fighting over. This simple fact represents a profound insight into our own nature. The very tools we create to provide security often become the new focal points for our deepest insecurities and conflicts. But fire also changes cooperation. It brings people together. It lengthens the usable day, pushing back the darkness that for so long had dictated the rhythm of life. It softens tough roots and renders meat more digestible, unlocking a universe of calories and nutrients. This dietary shift alone may have been a critical factor in supporting the growth of our larger, more energy-hungry brains. More importantly, however, fire creates the conditions for something new. The extended conversation, complex planning, the sharing of memory, and possibly the slow burn of resentment. Imagine a circle of early humans sitting around a flickering hearth. One has a better stone tool, another has a larger share of the day's kill. Someone speaks more often, someone else is always made to listen. Someone looks into the dancing flames and wonders how long this fragile balance will hold. With fire, we gained leisure time, and leisure time lets grievances ferment. This new social space, illuminated by the hearth, also allowed for the observation of subtler human cues. In the shifting firelight, faces become more expressive, emotions harder to hide. This may have fostered greater empathy and social bonding, allowing our ancestors to read intentions and build trust more effectively. But this same intimacy has a darker side. The firelight that builds trust also exposes vulnerability and can amplify the subtle politics of exclusion. A shared glance, a whispered word just out of earshot, a deliberate shifting of bodies around the warmth. These small acts of social maneuvering become visible, memorable. The fire gathers people, but it also reveals them in all their loyalty and all their quiet ambition. What about the tools they held in their hands? This period saw the refinement of older technologies, but were they just for hunting, or was their purpose beginning to shift? Just like the firelight. What about weapons? In this period we see the widespread refinement of the Acheulean and early Middle Paleolithic tool traditions. Hand axes, the signature tool of the time, become more symmetrical, their flakes struck with a new and startling precision. There is a certain deadly elegance to them. But more than that, there is direct evidence that wooden spears like those found at the remarkable site of Schöningen, in what is now Germany, were being used to hunt large game as early as 400,000 years ago. These spears were astonishingly sophisticated, over 2 meters long, sharpened at both ends, and carefully balanced for weight and trajectory. They were likely not thrown from a distance, but used for close, powerful thrusting. But close, as any hunter knows, is close. And when a tool is that effective at piercing the thick hide of a horse or a mammoth, it does not take much imagination to understand what it would do to a rival. Still, for all this potential, there is no direct evidence from this period of those weapons being used on other humans. We have found no skeletons with spear wounds, no mass burials that hint at a forgotten battle. But this profound absence might not mean peace, it may just mean impermanence. Violence, ironically, often leaves fewer traces than cooperation, because it so frequently interrupts the very processes of burial and preservation that allow a story to enter the fossil record. Bodies left in the open air decay quickly. Bones are scattered by scavengers and weather. A quiet cooperative burial, on the other hand, is an act that protects the dead from the chaos of nature, giving them a chance to speak to us centuries later. This is a crucial insight. Our archaeological picture of the past is not a perfect photograph. It is a distorted reflection, one where the quiet rituals of community life are often more visible than the sudden chaotic acts of violence. And so we are left with a haunting paradox: tools that could kill and no definitive proof that they did. Yet the psychological landscape was undeniably shifting. Fire brought a new predictability to life. Tools brought a new sense of power, and somewhere in the space between the warmth of the hearth and the sharp edge of a flint blade, a new idea may have taken shape, that control was possible. Control of food, control of mates, control of territory, control of others. Some anthropologists have even suggested that fire itself might have been a factor in early social enforcement. That is, once fire became central to the group's survival, those who misused it or failed to tend it may have faced serious consequences. Did early times, Homo times, punish each other for letting the fire die or for hoarding access to its warmth? We do not know for sure, but the moment something becomes vital, it also becomes political. There is also a theory that fire may have helped to reduce spontaneous, impulsive violence. In modern chimpanzees, sudden outbursts of aggression are common. In bonobos, they are much rarer. One key difference is that bonobos have more stable food supplies and social structures that emphasize bonding over competition. For early humans, fire could have played a similar role. It centralized group activity. It created a zone of warmth and safety, reducing external stresses, and it allowed for longer periods of socialization. In this view, fire is a peacekeeper, a force that encourages storytelling, bonding, and perhaps even the first stirrings of empathy. But there is a darker mirror to that theory. The more a group bonds around its own fire, the more defined its borders become. The concepts of times us, times and times not us times begin to solidify. Group identity strengthens. Outsiders become more distinctly times other. The fire unites, but it also divides. Once a group sees itself as distinct, it can begin to think strategically about others. Who gets to join our circle of light? Who does not? And what happens if someone tries to take our fire away? Between 500,000 and 300,000 years ago, something happened in the human mind. A profound shift, not in morality, but in memory, in the ability to link past actions with future outcomes, in the capacity to hold a grudge, or to forgive, or to prepare. And that may be the most dangerous technology of all foresight. Once a group can imagine a future in which their rivals are weaker or gone entirely, they can begin to plan for it. Even if they never act on that plan, the possibility is there, flickering like a fire in the dark. So perhaps fire did not invent violence, but it gave us a new frame through which to see it. It gave us time to think. And once we could think, we could remember who had wronged us, and we could decide whether or not to wait for our moment. Can you have murder without war? Can someone be killed for reasons we will never know, in a world that left no witnesses, no laws, and no written memory? What does prehistoric violence look like when it leaves behind only a single silent wound and a quiet that lasts for hundreds of thousands of years? Between 300,000 and 100,000 years ago, the world was not at war, but it was not entirely peaceful either. There were no empires, no standing armies, no permanent villages defended by moats and walls. But there were people, real thinking people, who lived and died in a world shaped by shifting alliances, by the constant pressure of resource scarcity, and by emotional lives as deep and as complex as our own. And it is in that liminal space where memory disappears, but trauma can linger in the bones, that we find some of the earliest, most tantalizing clues that humans could be deadly to one another, even without being organized for it. By this point in human evolution, something was already profoundly different. The brains were bigger, the bodies were more gracile and modern. Homo sapiens times, as a distinct species, had begun to appear in the fossil record of eastern and southern Africa, while other hominins, sometimes our close relatives, still populated parts of Europe and Asia. These humans were not simple brutes. They crafted sophisticated tools. They controlled fire with practiced ease. Some groups even began to bury their dead. They were shaping their landscapes with a growing and deliberate precision. But among the broken animal bones and scattered campsites, archaeologists have also found something else: human injuries, lesions on bone, evidence of healed trauma, and sometimes tragically wounds that never healed at all. One of the clearest examples of possible interpersonal violence from this period is a skeleton known as Shanidar III. Discovered in what is now Iraqi Kurdistan in the Zagros Mountains, this individual was an adult male Neanderthal who lived sometime between 60,000 and 35,000 years ago. His remains were found in a cave alongside several others, many of whom showed signs of careful burial. But what makes Shanidar III so different is not just the context of his discovery, it is the wound. Etched into one of his ribs is a small, precisely angled lesion, the kind of injury consistent with a narrow projectile, possibly a spear, and possibly one that was thrown. The angle of the puncture has led some researchers to suggest that the weapon came from a distance, not from a close-quarters hunting accident, and certainly not from a self-inflicted wound. This was, they argue, a deliberate strike. This single mark on a single bone opens a universe of questions. Was it murder? Was it a skirmish between rival bands? Was it a calculated ambush? Or was it something else entirely? An accident between neighbours, a misunderstanding that spiralled out of control, a conflict over resources that simply went too far. We do not know, and we may never know. But the wound is there, and it did not heal. Whoever threw that spear, if it was indeed a spear, left no message, only the silent consequence. But we must be careful here. Shanidar III is a single powerful case, but it is often overinterpreted. He may not even fall neatly within the specific timeline of this chapter. as the dating of the site spans tens of thousands of years. More importantly, one case does not make a pattern. What makes this era so frustrating and so deeply fascinating is how rarely violence speaks to us clearly. Most human remains from this time are partial: a skull fragment, a jawbone, a few teeth. And even when we do find more complete skeletons, the vast majority show no obvious signs of trauma. Does that mean violence was exceptionally rare? Or does it simply mean that the kinds of violence practiced back then, a blow from a heavy stone, a shove off a cliff, rarely left a mark that could survive the ages? It is easier to kill someone with a blunt object than with a spear. It is easier to push someone than it is to stab them. If a person disappears in the forest, there are no headlines, no autopsies, just another missing body in a world already full of predators and dangerous falls. And so the violence of this period may be hidden just beneath the surface, obscured not only by time, but by the sheer difficulty of detecting intention in broken bones. This is a critical insight for understanding deep prehistory. The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. The silence in the fossil record might not signify peace. It might simply be the sound of a violence that was too efficient, too brutal, or too simple to leave a lasting scar. What we find then are just whispers. Still, some faint patterns do begin to emerge from the dust. In sub-Saharan Africa, archaeological sites from this era show clear evidence of complex tool use and sophisticated landscape management. Humans were living in organized bands, likely with defined territories, critical resource zones, and predictable seasonal migrations. When groups like this encounter each other, the outcome is never certain. It can lead to trade and cooperation, or it can lead to tension and conflict. We know from later periods that even small, simple foraging bands can be fiercely protective of their land and its resources. It is not at all unreasonable to assume that disputes happened, that individuals were sometimes killed, that someone crossed an invisible line and paid the ultimate price for it. But these were not yet wars. They were incidents, tragic and personal, but not yet institutionalized. In Europe and Western Asia, other hominin groups, including the Neanderthals and possibly the Denisovans, inhabited a vast and challenging landscape. Did they meet times, Homo sapiens times, during this specific time? Probably not in any significant way, not yet. But within their own populations, there is growing evidence of trauma. A comprehensive study of Neanderthal remains from across Europe found that a surprisingly high percentage showed signs of healed injuries, mostly concentrated on the head and upper body. Some of these were clearly hunting accidents, a confrontation with a large animal gone wrong. But others, particularly blows to the face and repeated fractures, may very well have come from interpersonal conflict. These injuries suggest a life that was not just hard, but often violent, a world where disputes were sometimes settled with force. This provides an important insight. Violence does not require a specific species. The capacity for it appears to be a shared ancient trait among several kinds of humans, suggesting its roots are deeper than any one lineage. Among early times, Homo sapiens times, the picture is just as murky, just as frustratingly incomplete. Sites like Omo Kibish in Ethiopia and Jebel Irhoud in Morocco have provided fossil evidence of early modern humans dating back as far as 300,000 years. But the remains are fragmentary. Most are incomplete skulls, making it nearly impossible to assess the cause of death or the presence of violence with any certainty. What we do see, however, is an increasing anatomical modernity. We see a face like ours, a brain case like ours, a body capable of everything we have done since. And that fact alone raises the profound question: if the hardware was already there, was the software of the mind already capable of murder? Perhaps the most striking thing about violence in this period is how utterly unorganized it appears to be. There are no mass graves. There are no clear battlefield contexts. There are no signs of systematic group-on-group killing. What we find instead are hints: a single cracked bone here, a punctured skull there, a healed fracture on a forearm. Enough to whisper of conflict, but not enough to explain it. One particularly telling and chilling case comes from the site of Cima de los Huesos in northern Spain. This site, which predates our target timeline slightly, but is deeply relevant, contains the remains of at least 28 individuals belonging to a species that was a common ancestor of both Neanderthals and modern humans. One skull, known as cranium 17, bears 2 closely spaced fractures on the forehead. Both were likely made by the same object, both occurred around the time of death, and neither could have been accidental. The implication is as clear as it is chilling. Someone struck this person twice in the face, possibly with a club or a sharp-edged tool, not in war, not in chaos, but up close, in close quarters, face to face. Even more haunting is what surrounds the skull. The site itself is a deep, vertical shaft, accessible only through a long, dark tunnel. The bodies appear to have been placed there deliberately. Whether this was a form of burial or simply a method of disposal is unclear. But they were not scavenged by animals. They were not scattered by the elements, and this suggests something new, something profound, memory, intention, perhaps even a form of ritual. Or at the very least a kind of respect, even for the dead who had met a violent end. What does this tell us? It suggests that murder may have existed long before war, that violence did not require nations or armies or ideology to ignite. All it needed was fear, or desire, or rage, or confusion, and a hand that did not stop in time. Across this entire immense span of time, from 300,000 to 100,000 years ago, humans were learning to live together in larger, more stable, and more complex groups. They were building vast libraries of knowledge in their minds, passing down tool-making traditions, managing fire with increasing skill, and maybe even beginning to shape the earliest symbolic behaviours that would one day define us. But they were also human, which means they were capable of inflicting profound hurt. This dual capacity for incredible cooperation and shocking violence is perhaps the most fundamental paradox of our species, a tension that was present from the very beginning and continues to shape our world today. What about psychological evidence? Of course, we cannot see thoughts in the fossil record, but some anthropologists argue that this period marks the deepening of our emotional and social awareness. The capacities for empathy, for shame, for profound grief were likely becoming more refined, and with these complex emotions came new vulnerabilities: the sting of jealousy, the pain of betrayal, the burning desire for revenge. These emotions are not modern inventions. They are ancient, possibly older than language itself, and wherever they live, violence is never far behind. But again we see no armies, no formal formations, just people living in caves under the shade of trees, by the slow-moving water of rivers. Sometimes they were alone, sometimes they were surrounded by their kin, and sometimes they were hurt in ways that the bones almost forgot to remember. So what are we left with? We are left with a strange, deep quiet, a long, pivotal chapter of human history, where people could kill, but did not yet coordinate to do so on a large scale. A time when an injury meant conflict, but not yet conquest. An era where death could be sudden and violent, but was not yet strategic in the way a military campaign island. And perhaps most importantly, a world where the line between a tragic accident, a form of communal punishment, and a cold-blooded murder is still almost impossible for us to draw. But the wounds are there. Not many of them, and not always clear in their meaning, but just enough to remind us that war is not the beginning of violence. It is only its organization. And long before war, we were already learning what it meant to lose someone, not to the harshness of nature, but to the hand of another human. The question then remains hanging in the air. How many of our distant ancestors died not because of the unforgiving world around them, but because of the humans beside them? And how many more will we simply never find their stories lost to the earth forever? This long period of unorganized personal violence sets the stage for a new kind of tension. As different human species began to expand their territories, they would eventually encounter one another. What happened when these two distinct kinds of human times, Homo sapiens times and Neanderthals, finally came face to face in the narrow corridors of the Levant? Did they trade? Did they fight? Or did they simply stare at each other across a valley? 2. Intelligent, capable peoples, recognizing a rival in the other's eyes. This next phase of our story is not about battles, but about boundaries and the long, quiet standoff that may have defined the future of our planet. Was there a prehistoric Cold War between species? Not a war of empires or declarations or flags, but something quieter, slower. A territorial stalemate that lasted for tens of thousands of years. Two different kinds of human walking, the same valleys, drinking from the same rivers, but rarely if ever trusting each other enough to share the fire. Between 250,000 and 40,000 years ago, the story of war still had no formal name, but all of the necessary ingredients were on the table. By now, the Neanderthals had spread across Europe and into parts of Western Asia, from the rocky coasts of the Atlantic to the imposing Caucasus Mountains. And times Homo sapiens, times newly emerging in Africa, had begun to appear in the Levant, a narrow contested corridor of land where continents and climates have always met. For thousands upon thousands of years, these two species may have stood on either side of a line invisible to the earth itself, but very real in the bones of their survival. This was not yet a world of armies, but it was a world of limits. The punishing Ice Age climates meant that much of northern Europe was uninhabitable for long, brutal stretches. The truly habitable zones were small, they were rich, and they were fiercely local. They were the river valleys, the sheltered caves, the coastal flats, the kinds of places where food, shelter, and fresh water all aligned. And in those precious alignments, the Neanderthals had already dug in. For over 200,000 years, Neanderthals had adapted to these environments with astonishing precision. Their bodies were short and broad, their bones thick, their musculature massive. Everything about them suggested a life of close-quarter survival. They hunted enormous animals like aurochs and woolly rhinoceros with heavy wooden thrusting spears. They controlled fire, they expertly butchered game, and they fashioned sophisticated stone tools from flint and bone. Their society was small-scale, but it was stable. Bands of perhaps 10 to 20 individuals, seasonally mobile, socially bonded. They buried their dead, they may have cared for their injured, and they knew their landscapes with an intimacy born of a memory that ran deeper than any single migration. Then, sometime around 180,000 years ago, something new appeared at the very edge of their world times, Homo sapiens. They likely did not arrive in force, and probably not for long, but the Levant begins to show traces of our kind of anatomically modern humans in sites like School and Kafse, in what is now Israel and Palestine. These humans came from Africa, likely journeying through the Sinai Peninsula, riding waves of favourable climate that opened up green corridors where deserts usually ruled. But they did not seem to stay. For tens of thousands of years, the presence of times Homo sapiens, times in the Levant, seems to blink in and out like a distant signal struggling to hold. They arrive, they leave, and then the Neanderthals return. Then they too are gone, retreating back into Europe. Back and forth, a shifting tide of hominin presence with no clear pattern and no obvious direct contact. Or was there? The archaeological record rarely gives us a clear picture of confrontation, but it does give us overlap. The layered sediments in caves like Kebera and Tabun show alternating phases of Neanderthal and times Homo sapiens, times occupation. Sometimes with long, empty gaps between them, and sometimes with none at all. Did they see each other across a valley? Did they compete for the same herds of gazelle? Did they fight? We simply do not know. But it is not unreasonable to imagine that two species so close in their ecological niche, so similar in their basic anatomy, would not pass each other in total silence. They hunted the same game, they used the same water sources, they built fires in the very same shelters, and they likely viewed each other not as exotic alien beings, but as rival animals, strange, uncannily similar, but decidedly not kin. This is a crucial insight. Our modern tendency to romanticize or demonize the other might obscure a more practical prehistoric reality, where difference was assessed not through a moral lens, but through the cold calculus of competition. Was it always hostile? Not necessarily. The most probable scenario is a complex and shifting, one-long periods of avoidance, moments of high tension, perhaps even rare instances of tolerance, followed by disappearance. For a very long time, neither species seemed able to push the other out completely, at least not yet. The Levant, that narrow and vital corridor, became something like a buffer zone and no man's land of prehistory. And when you cannot win through force, you win by outlasting, by waiting, by knowing when to retreat and when to advance. The idea that these early contact zones were essentially Cold War environments is not just a metaphor. In military history, a Cold War is defined by the absence of open declared conflict, but the constant simmering presence of strategic posturing, a tense standstill with immensely high stakes. And in this case, the stakes were nothing less than survival, not just for individuals, but for entire lineages. Some researchers have speculated cautiously that the relative stasis in this region for so many thousands of years may reflect a kind of balance of power. The Neanderthals, knowing their terrain with an ancient intimacy, may have held the strategic uplands and sheltered valleys, while the early times, Homo sapiens, times newer to the region, stuck to the coastal plains or more marginal zones. When the climate shifted, as it so often did during the Ice Age, corridors of opportunity would open or close, and with them, the rhythm of contact would change. We have found no battlefields, no defensive structures, no weapons embedded in bones from this specific period of overlap. But what we do have is proximity, and proximity in the natural world is never neutral. Even among modern primates, neighbouring groups often engage in a delicate dance of cautious avoidance, punctuated by sudden explosive aggression. There are border patrols, defensive postures, and competitive displays of strength. Among chimpanzees, this behaviour can escalate into lethal raids. Among gorillas, it tends to remain as bluster and noise. Among humans, it depends. This long period of potential coexistence forces us to consider that our ancestors, both sapiens and Neanderthal, were capable of a wider range of behaviours than simple fight or flight. They may have been masters of a third option, strategic patience, a form of non-violent competition that is incredibly difficult to see in the archaeological record. One of the most compelling pieces of indirect evidence for this kind of territorial tension comes from the sourcing of raw materials. Both Neanderthals and times Homo sapiens times made their stone tools from specific types of high-quality flint, often carried over long distances from known quarries. In several of these contact zone sites we see tool industries that seem distinct, different flaking techniques, different patterns of retouching and sharpening. This may simply reflect different cultural traditions, but it may also reflect a quiet, unspoken rule: times do not cross into their territory to get stone. Not because you will certainly be killed, but because you will not be welcome. Some anthropologists refer to this as non-violent conflict, a spatial grammar of competition. You do not need open war when strategic avoidance works, when each group understands the limits of its reach and the potential cost of trespassing. But that does not mean it is peace. It just means that for a time, the cost of direct confrontation outweighed the potential reward, until one day it did not. This era also includes the expansion of times Homo sapiens, times across North Africa, and eventually into Western Asia. Climate records suggest that brief wet periods, known as Green Sahara events, allowed migration routes to open up between the Nile Valley and the Arabian Peninsula. Each pulse of migration may have brought small groups of modern humans into Neanderthal-adjacent areas. Each pulse may have frayed the edges of that quiet, invisible border just a little more. What about conflict within the groups themselves? Among the Neanderthals, the record remains sparse but suggestive. As we have seen, injuries to Neanderthal skulls, especially frontal trauma, appear in a significant number of specimens. Some are clearly accidents, hunting mishaps, falls from cliffs, but others may well reflect interpersonal violence, blunt force trauma, and defensive wounds, healed fractures that tell a story of survival. Not war, but not peace either. Just the messy, complex spectrum of primate social behavior, of emotions, hierarchy, and the friction of proximity. There is one more theory worth mentioning, not as an established fact, but as a sobering possibility. In certain areas, Neanderthals may have initially outnumbered times, Homo sapiens times, but perhaps lacked the demographic resilience or organizational flexibility to respond to this new form of competition. What looks to us like coexistence may have actually been a slow, creeping replacement, not through a single decisive war, but through encroachment, territory by territory, cave by cave. Until one morning the smoke rising from the fire in the next valley was not from a cousin's camp, it was from a stranger's, and they did not leave. But even this is speculation, and speculation in the absence of clear, repeatable evidence is a luxury this story cannot afford. So we are left with this stark and perhaps more powerful image. Two distinct human species, sharing the planet for nearly 250,000 years of parallel existence. Sometimes living near one another, sometimes far apart. Possibly never friendly, possibly never openly violent on a large scale, but always aware on some deep, instinctual level that they were not alone. That the flicker of a night fire in the distant hills could mean another band, another face, another shadow walking the same trail home. And that perhaps is the deepest root of war. Not hatred, but ambiguity. Not a grand plan for conquest, but a gnawing uncertainty. When the line between a potential friend and a potential rival begins to blur, when you do not know whether the ones across the valley will trade with you or take what you have, caution becomes the only logical response. The Neanderthal story is far from over. It will continue with their eventual extinction, with the surprising discovery of interbreeding with the ghost of their DNA that still echoes in the blood of many modern humans. But that comes later in our timeline. For now, all we know is this: there was space, there was time, there was contact, and there was tension. Whether that tension ever truly exploded into widespread organized violence remains one of the oldest and coldest cases in all of human history. When did humans start thinking in tribes? Not fighting them, not yet fearing them, but simply knowing they were there. The ones who were not times us. The ones whose beads were fashioned in the wrong shape, whose red ochre was sourced from the wrong place, whose faces were just not quite right. Sometime between 150,000 and 50,000 years ago, something fundamental changed in the way humans saw each other. This was not yet the age of drawn borders or ethnic names or formal nations. There were no maps on which to draw a line, but there were lines all the same. Lines etched into skin with sharpened bone lines wrapped around wrists in the form of shell, jewellery lines smeared across faces in pigments of red ochre and soft black ash. Lines that said quietly but clearly, times we are, this not that. This is not the story of war, not yet, but it may well be the story of its essential prelude, because before you can fight a stranger, you first have to be able to recognize them as one. In southern Africa, near the sun-drenched southern tip of what would later be called the cradle of humanity, early times, Homo sapiens times, were leaving behind clues. They were tiny, almost insignificant ones. At sites like Blombos Cave, humans began making beads from time's Nassarius, time's shells, small spiraled mollusks that were carefully and deliberately perforated, smoothed and strung together. These beads are not food. They are not tools in any practical sense. They are decoration, and that makes them something strange, something new, a message with no immediate practical purpose. The beads at Blombos date to at least 75,000 years ago, though other nearby sites may push that number even further back in time. They are often stained with red ochre, a vibrant pigment made from iron-rich clay, and they show clear signs of prolonged wear against skin or clothing. These were not casual, disposable ornaments. They were worn again and again. They meant something. But what? Some anthropologists argue that personal ornamentation like this is the earliest form of identity signaling, a silent visual way to say, times I am part of this group, times without needing to speak a single word. These beads and pigments may have functioned like early passports, not official ones of course, but socially powerful ones. You wore your status, you marked your affiliations, and in doing so, you helped to create the first fragile barrier between the world of times us times and the world of times them. This provides a crucial insight into the human mind. Our species has a deep-seated need, not just to survive, but to belong. We create symbols of belonging not out of vanity, but out of a fundamental need to build and maintain the social cohesion that ensures our collective survival. The very act of creating shared meaning is what allows a group to act as one. That does not mean this new awareness was inherently hostile. Difference, it is important to remember, is not the same as division, but it does mean that humans were beginning to pay attention not just to the natural world of predators and prey around them, but to the symbolic one they were actively building inside their own minds. A world of intricate markers of shared meanings and of subtle unspoken rules about what it meant to truly belong. Elsewhere in Africa, the same pattern begins to emerge. At Pinnacle Point, at Sibudu Cave, at Dieppe Kloof Rock Shelter, humans were collecting and processing ochre engraving, abstract geometric shapes onto stones and ostrich eggshells, and experimenting with pigment mixtures that could adhere to skin, hide, or woven fibre. Some even appear to have developed compound adhesives, a sophisticated blend of ochre and plant resin that hints at both a practical knowledge of chemistry and a deep sense of intention. These complex mixtures may have been used to haft stone tools to wooden handles, but it is just as possible they were used to mark bodies for ritual or display. We do not know the exact meanings of these ancient symbols. We likely never will. But the sheer precision with which these pigments were gathered, ground, and applied suggests something more than simple utility. It suggests memory, it suggests ritual, it suggests recognition. By the time humans began their major expansion out of Africa and into Eurasia, sometime between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago, they brought these profound symbolic capacities with them. In the Levant, at sites like School and Kwafse, burials from this period include ochre-stained bones and carefully placed shell ornaments that directly mirror the southern African tradition. Further afield in Central Asia and parts of Eastern Europe, later times Homo sapiens times sites continue the practice. We find beads, pendants, even intricately etched ivory. These were highly mobile humans, walking thousands of kilometers across new and often dangerous terrain, but they carried meaning with them. They carried their identity. Why does this matter so profoundly to the story of war? Because meaning builds boundaries. When different groups share the same symbols, the same colors, the same patterns, the same raw materials, they form in-groups. When other groups lack those symbols or use them in a different way, the distinction becomes immediately visible. The cognitive shift required to recognize and interpret symbolic difference may be one of the most profound in all of human evolution. It is the moment that culture becomes a kind of code, and that code in turn becomes a form of caution. In modern hunter-gatherer societies, even small subtle differences in adornment can signal lineage alliance, marital status, or one's role in a ritual. A smear of face paint is not just art, it is a story, a password, and sometimes a warning. This reminds us that for most of human history, communication was not just verbal, it was written on the body itself. The way you presented yourself to the world was a constant, silent broadcast of who you were and where you belonged. And once that kind of signalling exists, the ability to recognize outsiders follows. Sometimes, that recognition is met with curiosity, sometimes with suspicion, but rarely does it happen without some kind of reaction. So when did this capacity for symbolic thought truly arise? There is no exact date, no single eureka moment where someone rubbed ochre on their cheek and sparked a cultural revolution. But the evidence consistently clusters around the late Middle Stone Age and the early Upper Paleolithic, roughly between 150,000 and 50,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens times began to display an increasing and undeniable tendency towards symbolic behavior, abstract thought, and strong group cohesion. They were not just making tools anymore, they were making meaning. And once you can make meaning, you can also make an enemy. In Europe, a parallel story begins to unfold. The Neanderthals, once thought to be incapable of symbolism, are now understood to have engaged in at least some forms of personal adornment. They collected eagle talons and the feathers of large birds. They modified shells and applied mineral pigments. At one remarkable site in Spain, Cueva de los Aviones, perforated shells stained with pigment have been dated to over 115,000 years ago. If this dating is correct, it would place symbolic behavior in Neanderthals well before it becomes common in Homo sapiens. But even if the dating is eventually revised, the underlying pattern remains. The line between these two human species was not a simple line of intelligence. It was perhaps a line of expression and cultural complexity. What is most important is not who did it first, but that both species did it at all. This suggests that the cognitive capacity for identity making, for drawing a line between the self and the other, was already evolving on multiple human branches. It is likely that even children were involved in these early cultural practices. The crafting of small shell beads requires fine motor skills and a great deal of attention, but not immense physical strength. The presence of small, child-sized ornaments in some burials suggests that these symbolic systems were learned early in life, passed down from one generation to the next, and constantly reinforced through daily practice. Group identity became something that was inherited, not genetically, but socially. And that is the very foundation of every human culture that has ever followed. The emergence of a clear sense of identity, however, does not necessarily mean the emergence of automatic hostility, but it does plant the seed, because once you can clearly recognize that you are one thing and they are something else, then the stage is set. Not for inevitable conflict, not necessarily, but for judgment. And judgment changes everything. We do not know if these early humans judged others harshly. They may have been open, flexible, and generous. But we do know that the symbolic mind has a powerful tendency to categorize, to group, to sort, to trust those who mirror our own customs and symbols, and to be wary of those who do not. These are ancient instincts. They are not evil, they are not wrong. They are simply part of the way the human brain attempts to survive in a complex social world, by reducing that complexity, by labeling, by learning who is safe. And when resources become scarce, when the rains fail or the great herds move, on those labels can harden into something much more dangerous. But again, there are no weapons here, no battles in the archaeological record of this time. There are just beads, pigments, and the quiet, momentous birth of social memory. One of the most famous and evocative finds from this entire era comes from the site of Border Cave in South Africa. Among the rich collection of artifacts are carved bone points, perforated shells, and what may be a form of early counting stick known as the Lebombo bone. The tools from this site suggest long-term planning and technical skill. The ornaments suggest a world rich with meaning. The combination of the two suggests a culture that was not just surviving, but actively narrating itself. It was a culture saying, "Times we are this. We have always been this. We will pass this on to our children." Asterisk. That may be the most profound moment in the entire prehistory of conflict. Not when someone threw the first stone with intent to harm, but when someone looked across a river at another group and thought, "Times they are not us." Not because of any immediate danger, not because of any past violence, but simply because of the colours they wore, the patterns they chose, the meanings they carried that did not belong to you. And from that simple, powerful thought, everything else becomes possible. Not inevitable, just possible. So we end this chapter here with no fighting, no screaming, just a human sitting by a fire, carefully stringing shells together. Maybe for beauty, maybe for pride, maybe for a story only their own people told. And on the far side of the valley, another group doing much the same. Different beads, different fire, no words exchanged between them. Not yet. But someday, one of those groups would cross that valley, and someone would have to wonder, should we welcome them or should we not? Were there ambushes before there were battles? Did the first organised raids begin not with the sound of drums or grand strategies, but with a single stone thrown from behind a tree? A quiet, coordinated movement through the tall brush, the decision made together or not at all to take something from someone who would not give it up freely. Between 50,000 and 20,000 years ago, the world was growing colder. This was the heart of the late Pleistocene, an age of advancing glaciers, of vast herds of megafauna, and of long, slow human dispersals across the continents. But beneath the grand climate records and the sweeping migration models, something more personal and more intimate begins to appear in the record, a subtle but persistent pattern in the bones. It is not found everywhere and not all the time. But in certain places and on certain skeletons, there are signs that people were not only dying, they were being killed together. Most of the evidence from this period is sparse, but that is to be expected. For this deep window of time, nearly every archaeological site we find is a small miracle of survival. Most human remains are fragmentary. Many are found without any clear context. We are looking at whispers in a geological storm. But when you line up these scattered whispers, a shape begins to form, and that shape looks less like random chaotic violence and more like calculated retaliation. Let us start our journey in North Africa. Along the Nile corridor, scattered burials from the late Pleistocene show a curious and unsettling frequency of traumatic injuries. Not in every case, not even in most, but in enough of them to suggest something more than just accident or bad luck. In particular, we see patterns of embedded projectile points. Small, sharp flint fragments, lodged in ribs in vertebrae or in limb bones, that point directly to intentional harm. One person falling on a spear might be a tragic accident, but 5 people from different archaeological layers and years found in the same region with similar injuries that begins to stretch the bounds of coincidence. Even more telling is the clustering of these wounds. When we find injuries on the front of the body, it is tempting to imagine combat face-to-face, a direct confrontation, whether through a planned duel or a sudden chaotic surprise. But when the trauma is located on the back or the side of the body, it implies something else entirely. It implies an ambush, a strike delivered before a defense can even be mounted. It suggests an attack from a distance, possibly from an assailant who was never even seen. This kind of violence is not yet war, in the formal sense, but it is not random. It suggests intent, it suggests planning, and it may even suggest group coordination, a collective decision to harm, to take, or to push someone else back from a valued territory. This is a crucial insight. The shift from individual acts of passion to group-based strategic violence represents a major turning point in our story. It is the moment when a personal grievance can become a collective mission. And it may not have been one-sided. In some regions, notably in parts of what is now Sudan and the Horn of Africa, the repeated use of certain key territories implies a cyclical pattern of reoccupation. If these areas held reliable sources of water or were on the migratory routes of seasonal game, they would have been immensely valuable. And in a harsh glacial world, value often meant pressure. One group leaves for the season, another group enters. Then the first group returns to find their temporary shelter burned, their stored resources gone, or worse, their kin missing. It does not take civilization to feel the burning heat of revenge. It only takes memory. Archaeologists sometimes refer to this as retaliatory raiding, a pattern seen in some later foraging societies, where acts of violence are not isolated events, but are rhythmic, cyclical. One attack leads to another, not for permanent conquest of territory, but for balance, to restore what was taken, or more often to prevent the appearance of weakness. In a world without formal laws, a reputation for strength was the only true shield. The problem, of course, is that most of this evidence comes from the bones of the dead, and the dead do not speak clearly. What we can see are the injuries, both healed and unhealed. The linear fractures on skulls from a club or a thrown stone, the telltale depressions in long bones, the punctures that align suspiciously with the spearheads or arrow points of the time. This is where the story of violence gets its first real physical form. In some rare and poignant cases, there is no healing at all, meaning the injury was either immediately fatal or occurred at the moment of death. In others, there is clear evidence of survival. The blow was delivered, the wound somehow closed, and the person lived on for a while, carrying the scar. In East Africa, a few lakeside sites show multiple individuals buried in close proximity with overlapping signs of violence. Some have suggested that these may be early massacre sites, moments where one small group was systematically overwhelmed by another. But we must be careful. Without a clear and undisturbed stratigraphy, it is incredibly difficult to say whether these people all died at the same time, or if their bodies accumulated in that spot across many generations. A cluster of violent injuries is not always a single brutal event. Sometimes it is a tragic pattern spread thin over many years of simmering conflict. Still, the implication is undeniably there. People were dying violently, and they were not always dying alone. Another thread of this story comes not from bones, but from the study of lithic technology, the stone tools themselves. By this period, both times, Homo sapiens times, and other surviving human groups had developed increasingly refined and deadly projectile points. Some were large and heavy, meant for thrusting spears, used in close quarters hunting of megafauna. Others were smaller, lighter, and designed for speed and distance. In particular, the emergence of microliths, small razor-sharp stone flakes that could be hafted onto composite weapons like arrows or darts, allowed for more efficient and accurate projectiles. These were not just for hunting. They could be used on people. And if you had the tools and you had the motive, and you had a deep-seated reason to believe that the group over the next hill would strike you first. If you did not, then what you had was a system. Not a formal war, but a behaviour, one that given enough generations might harden into a tradition. This is where the line between different kinds of violence begins to blur. In modern hunter-gatherer groups that have been studied ethnographically, the line between personal violence and group retaliation is often incredibly fuzzy. A feud over a woman, or a stolen item, or a remembered insult from a past generation can escalate, drawing in kin allies, and eventually the entire band. Sometimes these conflicts cool down, resolved through negotiation or ritual. Sometimes they end in death. But once the cycle of revenge begins, it is notoriously hard to stop. There are debts to be paid, there are expectations to be met, there is honour to be defended. Could similar dynamics have existed among these Pleistocene humans? It is highly possible. We know from dental wear patterns and skeletal isotopes that many groups in this period had high mobility. They were not rooted to one place, but they often returned to favoured, resource-rich sites year after year. This means they may have encountered the same neighbours again and again, sometimes to trade, sometimes to argue. And in the long, dark quiet of an Ice Age night, it is not hard to imagine stories being told around a fire. Stories about that group by the lake, about what they did last season, about how they cannot be trusted. And stories, as always, are more powerful than spears. What we do not find in this period is structure. There are no walls, no fortifications, no professional class of warriors. There are no grave goods that indicate a separate caste of fighters, no iconography of battle painted on cave walls. This is not yet a military world. It is a social one, where violence, when it does come, is intimate, it is local, and it is recurring. And that in some ways is more chilling, because it means that no one was truly safe and no one was exempt. This is a crucial insight. The formalization of war with its rules and professional soldiers can sometimes create a buffer for civilians. But in this earlier world, everyone was a potential combatant, and every encounter held the potential for conflict. One of the best indicators of this shift comes not from the dead, but from how the dead were treated by the living. In several sites from this era, bodies appear to have been carefully buried despite showing clear signs of trauma. A violent death did not make someone a pariah, it made them something else. Maybe a symbol, maybe a warning, maybe a martyr. This shift towards a social memory of violence is absolutely crucial. It means that people were beginning to recognize patterns, to connect events, to remember what had happened, and to act on it. You do not retaliate without a narrative. So this is where we find ourselves in the closing chapters of the vast Pleistocene epoch. Scattered groups of humans living in dramatically changing climates are carrying sharper and more effective tools, and are just beginning to keep score. There are still no walls, still no armies, but maybe, just maybe, there is a list. And that list, whether it was scratched onto a piece of bone or whispered by a dying fire, was not just about the past, it was about the future. Because once a group begins to expect that it will be raided, it begins to plan, and once it plans, it prepares. And once it prepares, the storm is no longer gathering on the horizon, it has already begun inside their minds. Did war begin in a flooded graveyard? If there was ever a single place on earth where the profound silence of ancient bones might be mistaken for an answer, it is a small patch of sand and riverbank in the far north of Sudan, not far from the Slapin border with modern Egypt. The site is now called Jebel Sahaba. Its archaeological layers are shallow. The people who lived there were few, but its wounds run deep, and they have been echoing through anthropological debates for nearly half a century. The year was approximately 14,000 years before the present. This part of the Nile Valley, a region known as Nubia, had not yet been swallowed by the relentless desert. Back then, it was a wetter, greener world, a landscape full of swaying reeds and abundant fish, all shaped by the winding memory of a river that had not yet been tamed by dams or diversions. The people who lived here were fisher-foragers. They moved with the seasons they left behind, their distinctive stone tools, their ancient hearths, and the faint traces of meals eaten long, long ago. And in one particular spot, just a few meters from the riverbank, they left behind something else, a cemetery. And within that cemetery, what some researchers have called the oldest direct evidence of organized group-on-group conflict in all of human history. When Jebel Sahaba was first excavated in the 1962 by a team led by Fred Wendorf, it sent a tremor through the anthropological world. 61 individuals were uncovered, men, women and children, buried together in a series of shallow pits. A significant number of them showed clear signs of physical trauma, but not the kind that comes from accidental falls or the hazards of a hunting life. These were targeted specific injuries. There were projectile points embedded directly in their bones, severe skull fractures from blunt force and deep cut marks on their forearms and ribs. To the early researchers, it looked like a massacre, and for decades, that is how it was described, the first battlefield cemetery, the definitive proof that by 14,000 years ago, humans were not just capable of interpersonal violence, but of coordinated and possibly sustained conflict between entire groups. This discovery challenged the long-held notion that our hunter-gatherer ancestors lived in a state of primitive innocence. It suggested that the capacity for organized killing was not a product of civilization, but something that preceded it, something born in the wild heart of the Stone Age. But of course, science rarely holds still. In recent years, new eyes, armed with new technologies, have returned to these ancient wounds. The Belgian anthropologist Isabelle Crevecoeur and her colleagues undertook a detailed reanalysis of the original skeletal remains using modern imaging techniques, better contextual data from the original excavation notes, and an updated understanding of how trauma presents in ancient bone. Their findings were striking. Not only did the injuries at Jebel Sahaba show signs of repeated episodic violence, with some individuals bearing evidence of both healed and unhealed wounds, but the distribution of the trauma seemed to cluster around certain areas of the body. The upper limbs, the pelvis, the head, a pattern that suggested defensive wounds, and in some cases, execution-style killings. This is a crucial insight: healed trauma, alongside fatal injuries, on the same skeleton, tells a story of a life lived with violence, not just a single violent end. It speaks to a world where conflict was a recurring feature, a known and anticipated danger. Even more intriguing was what was not there. There were no formal specialized weapons. The stone points found embedded in the bodies were simple microliths, the very same kinds of small, sharp flakes that were used in daily life for fishing and hunting. But their presence especially lodged in fragile areas like the cervical vertebrae, and even the eye sockets suggested they were not stray projectiles from a chaotic hunt. These had been aimed. Whether in a calculated ambush, a chaotic skirmish, or something closer to a ritualized execution, it was clear that people were being deliberately, systematically killed. So what does this all mean? Was Jebel Sahaba the site of the world's first war? The answer depends entirely on how we choose to define the word. Some scholars argue that the term war should be reserved for large-scale, organized, multi-event conflicts with formal leadership and clear strategic goals. Others take a broader, more inclusive view, defining war as any recurring group-based violence carried out by identifiable collective groups. Jebel Sahaba in this second framing would certainly qualify. Not because of its scale, which was small, but because of its undeniable pattern. The trauma is not random, it is consistent. It spans multiple individuals across different age groups, and crucially, some of it shows signs of healing. That means there were survivors. And if there were survivors of one attack, there may very well have been retaliation in the future. What makes this site even more compelling is the burial itself. These people were not simply discarded or left exposed to the elements and scavengers. They were interred carefully, often in extended positions, sometimes even with simple grave goods. That suggests they were mourned, they were remembered. Their deaths were not just the end of their individual lives, they were significant events that shaped the lives of those who remained. That too may mark a critical turning point. Because war is not just about the act of killing, it is about memory, about keeping score, about remembering who did what, and deciding what must be done next. Some researchers have suggested that the people buried here were the victims of a single, catastrophic, violent event, a brutal ambush perhaps, or a failed defense of their riverside camp. Others believe the trauma points to a more drawn-out episodic conflict, a series of small, vicious raids repeated over the course of years or even generations, with casualties slowly and tragically accumulating over time. The truth may lie somewhere in between. We may be looking at a community that was caught in relentless cycles of seasonal conflict, living always on the very edge of danger and eventually being overwhelmed by it. There is no clear sign of who the attackers were. There are no burned structures, no foreign toolkits left behind, no written threats carved into stone. But we do not need those things to understand the stakes. If two or more groups were competing for access to the rich resources of the Nile floodplain, the seasonal fish runs the freshwater springs, or just a patch of secure territory, then tension was all but inevitable. Now add into that mix high mobility, a deep capacity for memory, and a growing sense of group identity, and you do not need generals to start a war. You just need fear. You just need loss. You just need the unwavering belief that next season they will come again. Jebel Sahaba may be the very first site where archaeologists can trace not just an act of violence, but its lingering echo. The trauma was collective, the burial was deliberate, and the profound silence surrounding it, the absence of any other known mass burial site from this entire period, makes it stand out all the more. A lonely graveyard on a riverbank, a marker of something ancient and terrible, shifting in the way humans lived and died. This is a critical insight. The decision to bury the dead with care, even after a violent end, signifies that the violence was not meaningless to the survivors. It was an event that needed to be processed, to be memorialized, to be incorporated into the story of the group. And once violence becomes part of a group's story, it is much more likely to be repeated. But here is where we must pause and admit what cannot yet be proven. We do not know for certain if this was a war, not with the kind of certainty that headlines demand. We know that people died from wounds inflicted by other people. We know that they were buried with care, that some had been wounded before and survived, that the sharp stone points lodged in their bones were more than capable of killing. But we do not know the cause, the provocation, the names, the stories. We do not know if this was an act of defense or an act of aggression, if it was one single battle or a series of many, if the group buried here was a band of raiders themselves or the unfortunate victims of one. We do not know who they were angry at or who they feared. What we do know is this: by 14,000 years ago, human conflict had crossed a threshold. It was now capable of leaving behind not just wounded bodies, but wounded communities. Communities who remembered who buried and who grieved, and that may be the beginning of something else entirely. Because when violence becomes a story, when it leaves the skin and enters the collective mind, it becomes a part of culture. It can be taught, it can be repeated, and it can be justified. Jebel Sahaba is not a myth. It is a collection of bones in a riverbank held together by nothing more than sand and time. But the myth it leaves behind of enemies, of threats, of people who are not times may be even older than the grave itself. And so we must ask ourselves, did war begin in a flooded graveyard? Or did it begin in the heavy silence that followed when someone looked at the bodies of their kin and thought, times we must never let that happen again, or worse times we must make sure they can never do it again? What happens when people stay in one place for too long? It sounds like the beginning of a cautionary tale, or perhaps just the quiet origin of the modern world. Because before there were drawn borders, before there were standing armies or organised agriculture or kings with maps, there was something far simpler. There were people not moving. For the vast majority of our species' time on this earth, mobility was the very key to survival. The resources moved, so we did too. The great herds shifted with the changing seasons. The rivers flooded and then receded. The fruit-bearing trees ripened and then vanished. In this fluid, ever-changing world, the concept of ownership was not about the patch of land beneath your feet. It was about memory, it was about pattern, and it was about the profound ability to find what you needed again and again. Next spring, next hunt, next moon. But something began to change around 15,000 years ago. It happened slowly, inconsistently, and certainly not everywhere at once. In certain privileged parts of the world, particularly the Levant, the Upper Nile Valley, and the eastern arc of the Fertile Crescent, human groups began to stay put for longer and longer stretches. This was not yet full-scale agriculture, not the kind with ploughed fields and permanent fences. But it was something in between, a new rhythm, a new and profound relationship to space. Archaeologists call it sedentism, and it was not a single brilliant invention. It was a side effect, a byproduct of a unique combination of ecology, abundance, and oddly enough, success. In the Levant, the Natufian culture gives us some of the earliest archaeological glimpses into this momentous transformation. Around 13,000 years ago, in what is now Israel and Jordan, small, permanent stone settlements began to appear. We see circular dwellings dug partly into the earth for insulation. We see stone pestles and mortars and flint-bladed sickles. This was not farming exactly, but it was intensive harvesting, the gathering of wild cereals in large enough quantities to be stored. And with storage for the first time came the need to guard. It is easy to underestimate just how strange and revolutionary this was from an evolutionary perspective. For millions of years, food had been consumed quickly or shared widely throughout the group. The simple realities of rot and rivalry kept things moving. But now, for the first time in human history, calories could be accumulated. Dried seeds, roasted nuts, preserved pulses, all stored in hidden caches and buried pits. Hunger, which for so long had been a shared communal emergency, was on its way to becoming a private individual event. And that may have been the beginning of something irreversible. Because when food stays in one place, so do the people who desperately want it. This is a crucial insight. The surplus that provides security from hunger simultaneously creates a new kind of social vulnerability. The very thing that frees a society from the whims of nature also makes it a target for the ambitions of other humans. In North Africa, similar patterns emerged along the Nile and into what is now the Sahara during one of its brief green fertile phases. Water levels fluctuated with powerful monsoonal pulses, creating rich, verdant patches that could be used year after year. Fishing-intensified storage pits became more common, and cemeteries grew in size and permanence. But with all of this newfound stability came a new kind of tension. Not open conflict, not necessarily, not yet, but pressure. Because sedentism, unlike mobility, creates boundaries. If you have built a dwelling, if you have dug a granary, if you have buried your dead in a specific place, that land starts to feel like yours. And if someone else camps too close next season, or takes grain from your pit, or fishes in your weir, a line has been crossed. And so sometime between 15,000 and 9,000 years ago, humans began doing something entirely new. They began defending invisible lines. There are no great walls yet, no fortresses perched on hilltops. But in the soil, in the careful layout of the houses, in the tight protective clusters of burials and hearths and shared storage areas, a new idea is taking form: territory. Not just a space that is used, but a space that is claimed. It is important to state that this did not happen all at once or everywhere. Many groups remained mobile for thousands more years, many still do today. But where sedentism did take root, something began to shift in the very psychology of the land. It became remembered, mapped out in stories tied to the ancestors who were buried beneath it, and measured not just in distance but in deep emotional meaning. And once a place means that much to you, to your family, to your dead, it becomes much harder to leave and much, much harder to share. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer groups have long noted the crucial difference between generalized sharing economies and more territorial models. The Hadza of Tanzania, for example, have historically maintained flexible access to vast, overlapping foraging zones, rarely attempting to enforce exclusive rights to a particular area. But in other groups, particularly those who live in environments with seasonal, predictable abundance, like the tribes of the Pacific Northwest of North America, access to critical resources, like salmon runs and nut groves, is tightly regulated. Not with fences and walls, but with intricate rules, with powerful ancestral memories, with the simple, unassailable logic of who came first. And this may be the key to understanding the deep roots of later, more organized conflict. Because war does not require cities or kings or bronze armor. It only requires two groups of people who both believe they have the absolute right to the same place and the unwavering will to prove it. The Natufians, for all their innovations, may have lived in a kind of uneasy, fragile balance. Their semi-permanent villages show clear signs of repeated occupation, but also of periodic sudden abandonment. Some of their burials are isolated and simple. Others are tightly packed and elaborate. And there are hints, just faint hints of interpersonal violence. A fractured skull here, a healed rib there. It is not enough to call it war, but it is enough to suggest a world of constant low-level friction. Even more revealing are the storage pits dug deep into the earth, lined with stone or clay, and often hidden beneath the floors of the houses. Some of these pits are large enough to feed dozens of people for a season. Others are almost too small to justify the effort of digging them, unless, of course, you consider the act of hiding. Unless you imagine what it truly means to store something that you know another person might desperately want to take. This is a critical insight. The first fortifications were not walls around a village, but the hidden spaces within it. The act of concealing surplus is an admission of social mistrust, a silent acknowledgement that the greatest threat might not be the storm or the wolf, but the neighbour. Territory is not just a physical claim, it is a profound psychological shift. It is the birth of a belief that space can be possessed, and by extension, that people can trespass. Once you have that belief, you do not need maps, you do not need written laws, you only need memory and a willingness to act on it. By around 10,000 years ago, in the early Neolithic period, this shift becomes visible across multiple regions of the world. In the Zagros Mountains, the first small villages cluster around predictable water sources. In the Nile Valley, seasonal encampments slowly transform into permanent ritual sites, and in the Jordan Valley, architectural continuity begins to emerge with house foundations being rebuilt in the very same spot generation after generation. This is the beginning of inheritance, not just of tools or names, but of place. An inherited space brings with it a whole new suite of pressures, not just from outsiders, but from within. Once land is passed down, conflict can arise between siblings, between lineages, between clans. Violence need not always come from the outside. Sometimes the most bitter fight is over the field next door. Sometimes it is over who gets to plant the fig tree this year. We do not have texts from this time. There are no written records of these early disputes, no detailed lists of grievances. But we do have the silent testimony of the bones, the houses, and the slow fossilization of a new and powerful idea that land has immense value, and that value can and must be defended. All of this, of course, is the clear vision of hindsight. For those who actually lived through this transformation, there was no grand manifesto, no formal declaration that the age of sedentism had arrived. It simply happened because it could. Because the climate was right, the rivers flowed, and the wild grains grew in abundance. But like so many pivotal turning points in human history, its consequences were not limited to calories. They touched every single part of social life, who you lived near, who you married, who you buried, and ultimately, who you feared. And so, we return to our central question: what happens when people stay in one place for too long? They remember, they build, they bury. They begin to define themselves in relation to the land, and eventually in opposition to those who do not share that connection. Territory is not born from maps. It is born from memory, from storage, and from the deep, visceral feeling that you have shaped a place, and that it in turn has profoundly shaped you. And once that powerful bond forms, it is only a matter of time before someone or something tries to test it. The story of war does not begin with rage. It begins with roots, with the act of staying with the quiet, unshakable certainty that times this place is ours times, and that anyone else might be a threat, whether or not we are ready to admit it. What happens when you can kill someone without ever seeing their face? For the vast majority of human evolution, that simply was not an option. Death was an intimate, up-close affair. It smelled like sweat and fear. It required direct physical contact, immense pressure, precise timing, a crushing blow from a heavy rock, a powerful thrust with a wooden spear, a coordinated, chaotic rush with stone blades and sharpened antlers. But sometime between 20,000 and 8,000 years ago, all of that changed. A new kind of death emerged, one that was distant, silent, and terrifyingly fast. And the world never fully went back. This is the story of projectiles, of the strange and pivotal moment in prehistory when simple hunting tools became something more. Not because anyone consciously designed them to be weapons of war, but because, like so much in the story of evolution, they were simply too useful not to be. Let us begin with the bow. It is almost absurdly difficult to find the definitive origin of the bow and arrow. Wood decays, sinew dissolves, and gut strings rot away to nothing. What we do find are the clues, indirect, scattered, and deeply suggestive. We find small stone points perfectly sized to fit on arrow shafts. We find microscopic wear patterns on their grooves, hints of the hafting resin used to bind them. And in some exceptionally rare cases, we find fragments of the weapons themselves preserved by freak conditions of extreme cold dryness or the anaerobic environment of a peat bog. The oldest clear and undisputed evidence of bow use comes from the site of Stellmore in northern Germany, dating to around 12,000 years ago. Here, archaeologists uncovered ancient pine arrow shafts and barbed bone points, buried in a peat bog alongside the remains of reindeer. The kill patterns on the animal skeletons suggest deliberate targeting, an understanding of trajectories and immense practice. This was not random violence, it was precision. This is a critical insight. The development of the bow was not just a technological leap, but a cognitive one. It required a new level of planning, foresight, and an intuitive understanding of physics that represents a significant evolution in the human mind. But that is not necessarily where the story of projectiles began. There are earlier signs, much earlier, that our human ancestors were experimenting with projectile technology. In Sibudu Cave in South Africa, micro-residue and use-wear analysis on ancient stone points suggests that by around 64,000 years ago, people were already mounting small sharp blades onto shafts and launching them with some kind of powerful force multiplier. Whether this was a true bow or a spear thrower like the atlatl remains a subject of intense debate, but the underlying intent is clear: distance, and distance changed everything. With thrown weapons, the fragile human body no longer needed to close the dangerous gap between hunter and prey. This dramatically reduced the risk of injury. It massively increased the element of surprise. And most importantly, it introduced the revolutionary concept of range, a physical and psychological buffer between the one who inflicts harm and the one who is harmed. In the world of hunting, this was a complete revolution. A large, wounded animal no longer had to be chased down and dispatched with a risky close-quarters stab. It could be brought down in motion before it even saw the hunter. This made entirely new kinds of game possible: faster prey, more skittish species, and the vast, formidable herds that roamed the open terrain. But in social terms, it opened up something else entirely. Because if a bow can bring down a deer from 100 paces, it can just as easily bring down a human. Now, this was not yet warfare. There is no evidence of archery-based combat in these very early archaeological layers. We see no mass killings, no coordinated raids with rows of archers. But what we do begin to see, especially in the Mesolithic layers of Europe and parts of North Africa, are individual skeletons with injuries that could plausibly have been caused by projectile weapons: a small, sharp point lodged in a rib, a narrow, clean puncture in the spine, healed fractures consistent with the impact of sling stones or other high-speed projectiles. There are not many of them, certainly not enough to infer organised group-on-group combat. But there are just enough to show that the technology had entered a new and more dangerous phase of its use. One of the key features of the bow and the sling is psychological, not physical. It is the removal of reciprocity. In a fist fight, pain is mutual. In a close-quarters conflict with clubs or knives, the threat is symmetrical. You can be hurt just as easily as you can hurt. But with a projectile, that delicate balance of risk is shattered. You can kill without any immediate physical consequence to yourself. You can escape unseen. You can send a message or silence one without ever entering the physical space of your target. This is a profound insight into the nature of violence. The more distant and abstract we make the act of killing, the easier it becomes to do. The bow and arrow may have been the very first technology to introduce this dangerous psychological distance into human conflict. The bow also required a new level of planning and foresight. Arrows needed to be carefully crafted, stored, and protected from moisture. Bowstrings had to be properly tensioned and maintained. Targets, whether animal or human, had to be tracked and approached from downwind. This was not brute violence. It was a skill, a system, a science. And once that system had been mastered for the hunt, its application to human conflict became all but inevitable. not necessarily from malice, but from sheer cold utility. Interestingly, the spread of this new projectile technology was not uniform. In some regions, it arrives early and flourishes. In others, it arrives much later or seems to be absent entirely. Climate certainly played a role. Dense forests may have favoured close-range weapons like spears, while the open plains rewarded the advantage of distance. But culture mattered too. In places with a strong cultural emphasis on ritualised duels or face-to-face displays of status, the impersonal efficiency of the bow may have disrupted traditional norms of conflict. It was in some ways too efficient, too impersonal, too quiet. Then there is the sling. Far less famous than the bow, the sling is one of the most underestimated and effective weapons in all of human history. Made from simple woven fibres and a small pocket of leather or cloth, it could hurl stones at astonishing speeds, up to 120 kilometers per hour, in the hands of a skilled user. And it left almost no archaeological trace. A slingstone, after all, is just a stone indistinguishable from the natural environment, unless it has been deliberately and uniformly shaped, which was not always the case. But ethnographic studies and historical records from later periods show the sling to be a devastatingly effective tool, especially when used by a group in concert. A coordinated barrage of slingstones could scatter animal herds, repel intruders from a territory, or signal ownership of a resource, without ever requiring direct physical contact. And again, it worked from a distance. In this period, roughly between 20,000 and 8,000 years ago, we are not yet seeing organised armies, but we are beginning to see the seeds of something profoundly new. The ability to apply lethal force without closing, the physical gap, the cognitive separation of an action from its immediate tangible consequence, and perhaps, just perhaps, the earliest emergence of what we might now call premeditated lethality. This does not mean that every archer was a murderer, nor that every sling was used against a neighbour. The vast majority of these tools were still being used to feed families, to defend camps from predators, or to signal to other members of a hunting party across a wide valley. But once the technology existed, the potential did too. And that potential changes how humans relate to the very concept of threat. Because with a bow, you do not have to wait. You do not have to talk. You do not have to give a warning. You just draw, and you release. Some archaeologists have argued that the appearance of bows and other projectile weapons correlates with increasing social complexity and hierarchy. Others suggest the opposite, that in times of scarcity or social fragmentation, distance weapons become essential tools of survival, not of status. The archaeological evidence does not resolve this debate, but it does suggest a period of intense transition. In burials from the Mesolithic era, in places like Offnet Cave in Germany or the Iberian sites of Portugal and Spain, we find individuals with clear signs of high-velocity trauma. There are not many of them, and the injuries are not always clearly and definitively linked to arrowheads, but they are clustered enough in time and space to raise profound and unsettling questions. Were these just hunting accidents? Were they the tragic outcomes of personal disputes? Or were they the first faint echoes of coordinated group-based violence? We do not know for sure, and we must resist the powerful temptation to dramatize the past. There is a long and unfortunate tradition in popular science of projecting modern cinematic warfare backwards into prehistory, of imagining epic battles with disciplined rows of archers and grand strategic ambushes in the forest. But the evidence is simply too thin for such grand narratives. What we see instead is a new technological capacity and a deep behavioural ambiguity. And that perhaps is the most human thing of all, because the very same tool that can feed your child can also kill your rival. The same arrow that brings down a gazelle might one day be used to silence a voice that challenged your authority. Tools themselves are neutral, but their consequences are not. By the end of this period, around 8,000 years ago, projectile weapons had become widespread across Eurasia, Africa, and parts of the Americas. Their designs varied greatly. Composite bows, Simple self-bows, powerful slings, with carefully shaped projectiles, and darts launched with the aid of weighted shafts. But the underlying principle was always the same: transfer energy across space, change the fundamental shape of violence, remove the ancient need to touch. And once that principle was common knowledge, something else changed. Something much harder to see in the bones. People began to anticipate violence from farther away. Camps were placed with line of sight in mind. Dangerous trails were avoided. Watchers were posted. The world, in a very real sense, became more dangerous. Not necessarily because people themselves had changed, but because the margin for trust had shrunk. You no longer had to be physically attacked to be killed. You just had to be within range. This is not yet war, but it is no longer truly peace either. It is a liminal zone, the edge of a new threshold, the time when the act of hunting bled into something else entirely, when the line between a predator and an enemy began for the first time to blur. And so we return to our central question: what happens when you can kill someone without ever seeing their face? You gain power, but you lose accountability. You change the rules of survival, but you also begin to sever the fragile thread of reciprocity that makes lasting peace possible. And in that silent, pregnant moment between drawing the bow and hearing the distant impact, a new kind of human consciousness emerges. One who can act without being seen, one who can strike without being touched, and one who can imagine violence as something that might not come back to them until, of course, it does. Can a cave painting prove there was a war? Can it prove that someone, somewhere, took pigment in hand and tried to remember a conflict, not with words, but with shapes, with bodies, and with the unmistakable arcs of deadly flight? When we think of prehistoric art, we usually imagine animals: bison frozen in mid-charge, deer suspended in a graceful leap, majestic horses, woolly mammoths, and wild cattle. But we do not often imagine humans, and certainly not humans, in the act of harming each other. Yet sometime between 10,000 and 6,000 years ago, that began to change. In the dry, protected rock shelters of Iberia, on the sun-blasted plateaus of the Sahara, and upon the weathered cliffs of the Levant, something new appeared in the artistic record. We see rows of small, stylized figures armed with bows. We see groups in coordinated motion, arrows, drawn taut bodies falling to the ground. We see scenes that feel far too organized to be a simple hunt, and far too human to be ignored. The Iberian Levant in modern-day Spain gives us some of the earliest and most intensely debated of these images. In rock shelters like Les Doga and Cova Remegia, painted in rich red ochre and sometimes in stark black, you find scenes where groups of small stick-like humans, often drawn with elaborate feathered headdresses or splayed limbs, face off in what appears to be direct confrontation. Some of them carry bows, others seem to be in dynamic motion, their bodies angled as if running or charging forward. And crucially, some of the figures lie horizontally on the ground, with clear lines representing arrows protruding from their bodies. These are not animals, these are people. The paintings are minimalist, almost abstract. There are no facial expressions, no grand architectural backdrops, just stark clusters of figures, lines, and movement. But that movement is unmistakably coordinated. The figures are grouped together, and the bows are often drawn in the same direction. And when a body falls, it often falls beneath a veritable cloud of arrows. Now, could this be a ritual dance? Could it be symbolic, not literal? A depiction of a myth or a ceremony rather than an actual physical conflict? Yes, that possibility must be taken very seriously, because pigment on rock is not a photograph, it is a story. And stories can be many things: warnings, memories, prayers, even deliberate lies. But the constant repetition of certain key elements across many different sites, the postures of aggression, the distinct clusters of archers, the fallen bodies suggests a powerful underlying pattern. And in archaeology, a pattern is data. Not proof, not certainty, but data. What these Iberian scenes show us is a new kind of self-awareness, a new willingness to depict human-on-human conflict as something worth recording. These were not casual scribbles. They took time, they required the collection and preparation of pigments, and they demanded deliberate placement on the rock face. In some cases, older animal paintings were deliberately painted over, replaced by these new scenes of human conflict. And that act alone is deeply meaningful. It suggests a fundamental shift in what mattered most to the people who created them. This is a crucial insight. Art does not just reflect reality, it creates it. By choosing to depict warfare, these early artists were making a statement about its importance in their world, elevating it from a random event to a central theme of their culture. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean and deep into North Africa, something equally eerie begins to appear. In the rock art of the Central Sahara, particularly on the Tassili and Niger plateau in modern-day Algeria, a series of paintings and engravings emerges from around 9,000 to 7,000 years ago. They show human figures, often in organized rows, carrying bows and sometimes shields. The style is different from that of Iberia, more abstract, in some cases more detailed in others. But the central theme recurs: motion, weaponry, and death. In one of the most cited and striking examples, you find a large composition featuring at least 30 human figures, 10 of whom are clearly in the act of drawing their bows. Opposing them, another group appears to retreat or fall. Some of these figures are pierced with lines that almost certainly represent arrows. There is no text, there is no voice, but the message is clear: this was not a peaceful gathering, and it was not an isolated one. Across the Sahara, in sites like Sefar and Jabaran, dozens of painted panels show similar groupings: archers' lines of advanced bodies, bent in pain or fallen in death. These are not depictions of isolated murders. They are not duels between individuals. They are something else entirely: coordinated, directional, and most importantly, remembered. The Levant adds yet another layer to this emerging picture. In the Negev and Sinai deserts, rock engravings, dated to between 8,000 and 6,000 years ago, show similar haunting themes. We see stylized humans, their bows drawn, their enemies retreating. The precision of the linework varies greatly. Some figures are crude and simple, others are more elaborate and detailed. But the underlying concept holds true. These were not predators and prey, these were peers. So what does it truly mean to paint violence? One answer is memory. That these were events too significant, too traumatic, or too triumphant to be forgotten. Perhaps they marked the death of a great leader, the successful defense of a critical watering hole, the profound loss of kin. They could be a record of a victory, a tragedy, or simply a stark warning to those who came later times. This is a place where blood has soaked the dust. Another answer is identity. To paint a conflict is to declare a definitive line between groups, between times us, times and times them, times between the self and the other. In that sense, these scenes might not depict battles that actually happened, but battles that times could times happen, or perhaps battles that times should times happen in the minds of those who painted them. They might be a form of ideology, not history. But a third answer is more subtle, and it has to do with cognition. The very act of painting organized violence suggests a profound conceptual shift. It means that people no longer saw conflict as a mere disruption of life, but as a structured, anticipated, and representable part of life. And once you can depict war, you can begin to plan it. This may have been the earliest form of propaganda. A row of archers painted on a prominent cliff wall is more than just a memory. It is a message. It says times we know how to fight. It says times we remember who we lost. It says times we are not prey. And for anyone approaching such a site, especially someone from a different group, that message would have landed with force. Not in words, but in the silent language of posture, of numbers of blood-red pigment that did not wash away with the seasonal rains. There is another layer too. In several of these sites, especially in Iberia, you find depictions of what appear to be executions. Isolated figures on their knees, while others stand above them with drawn bows or raised weapons. This is not combat. It is a form of theatre, a deliberate and perhaps public act of punishment, and it implies a social structure in which such acts were not only carried out, but also commemorated. This is not the chaos of a fight. It is the cold logic of control, of judgment, of rule. And once violence becomes formalized, even symbolically, the line between justice and power begins to blur. This provides a crucial insight. The representation of violence is not just about the past, but also about the future. By creating a permanent record of conflict and punishment, these societies were also creating a set of expectations, a cultural script for how violence should be managed and deployed in the generations to come. So can a cave painting prove there was a war? No, not on its own. But it can show that people had begun to think in ways that made war possible. That they imagined it, they remembered it, or they warned of it. That they saw the world in terms of groups, enemies, weapons, and consequences. That they had finally and irrevocably connected the idea of conflict with the idea of identity. And once that connection is made, once violence becomes representable, it also becomes repeatable. That is the haunting thing about symbols. They do not die when we do. They stay etched in stone, whispering old loyalties, rekindling old fears. They become templates, and so we look back at these ancient silent walls at the stick figures, with their drawn bows, at the red silhouettes pierced with lines. And we ask not just what happened here, but what was learned here. What new stories began to circulate around the fire? What new fears were passed down from parent to child? What triumphs were glorified? Because painting a deer is about survival, but painting a human that is about meaning. And meaning is where violence becomes something more, something remembered, something taught, something that is finally called by a name. And so we return to the shelter, to the dry cave wall, to the ochre-stained hand that traced out a row of archers, and we ask, who did they fear? Who did they hate? And more importantly, who were they trying to become?